Okay. The divorce is signed, and I must reveal that the slave is my son.
The papers trembled in Samuel Thornton's weathered hands as he signed his name on the divorce decree. Not a single word escaped his lips, but the secret he had harbored for 20 years was about to shatter 3 lives forever. In the silent courtroom of Richmond, Virginia, 1842, a truth lay buried beneath layers of deception so profound that even God himself might have turned away in shame. Have you ever kept a secret so devastating that revealing it would destroy everything you've built? Have you felt that crushing weight pressing against your chest each night as you lie awake, knowing that one day the truth would demand its reckoning? The late summer air hung heavy over Willow Creek Plantation, where the scent of tobacco leaves drying in the tall barns, mixed with the earthy aroma of freshly tilled soil. Located just outside Richmond, Virginia, the estate stood as a testament to the prosperity that defined the American South in the decades before Civil War would tear the nation apart. The plantation's white-columned main house overlooked acres of fields where dozens of enslaved men, women, and children toiled from sunrise to sunset, their backs bent under the merciless Virginia sun. The peculiar institution of slavery had been firmly established for generations, with human beings bought and sold as property, their lives and families subject to the whims of those who claimed ownership over them. Samuel Thornton was not born to wealth. The son of a modest tobacco farmer, he had married into prosperity when, at 23, he wed Elizabeth Carrington, the only daughter of one of Virginia's oldest and most respected families. Elizabeth brought to the marriage not only her family name but a substantial dowry that included Willow Creek and the people enslaved there. Now, after 20 years of marriage, Samuel had become accustomed to his position as a gentleman farmer, respected throughout the county for his fair dealings and temperate nature. Elizabeth had grown into a proud mistress of Willow Creek, hosting lavish dinners for neighboring planters and their wives, while managing the household with cold efficiency. Their union had produced no children, a fact that had become a source of deep tension between them over the years. In this void of shared love or purpose, their marriage had devolved into an arrangement of convenience, bound only by social expectations and financial interests. Among the enslaved people at Willow Creek was a young man named Jacob, who at 20 years old had become known for his remarkable intelligence and dignity despite his circumstances. Jacob worked primarily in the fields but was occasionally called to serve in the main house due to his neat appearance and quick mind. His complexion was lighter than most on the plantation, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the sharp eyes of the community. Whispers about his parentage had circulated among both the enslaved and the free for years, though none dared speak their suspicions aloud. Jacob's mother, Hannah, had passed away during a fever outbreak 5 years earlier, taking with her the truth of her son's lineage. Since then, Jacob had kept largely to himself, his deep brown eyes carrying a wisdom and sorrow that seemed beyond his years. The fragile balance of Willow Creek was disrupted on a spring morning when Elizabeth discovered letters hidden in Samuel's study. The correspondence exchanged between her husband and a widowed cousin in North Carolina revealed plans for Samuel to leave Virginia after settling his affairs. More damning than these plans were the tender sentiments expressed, exposing an affection that had clearly bloomed over many years of secret correspondence. Elizabeth's rage was immediate and cold. Within days, she had consulted with her family's longtime attorney and set in motion the uncommon, but not unheard of, process of divorce. In the South of 1842, divorce remained a rare and scandalous affair, especially among the planter class where family alliances often represented political and financial partnerships. But the Carrington family's influence was substantial enough to initiate proceedings while minimizing public spectacle. What Elizabeth could not have known was that Samuel's betrayal ran deeper than his affair with her cousin. For 20 years, Samuel had carried a secret that had gnawed at his conscience like a cancer eating away at his soul. Before his marriage to Elizabeth, during his first year working at Willow Creek as a manager for the Carrington family, Samuel had forced himself upon Hannah, an enslaved woman barely 17 years old. The encounter, an abuse of power so common on plantations across the South that it rarely merited mention, had resulted in the birth of a son 9 months later. Samuel had watched from a distance as Jacob grew from a small child into a young man, the evidence of his parentage becoming more apparent with each passing year. The shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way he walked with his head held at a particular angle, all reflected Samuel in ways that both haunted and fascinated him. He had ensured that Jacob received better treatment than most, intervening subtly when overseer punishment seemed excessive, providing small advantages when possible without drawing attention. Yet he had never acknowledged his son, never spoken a word of truth to the young man who worked as property on his land. As the divorce proceedings advanced, Samuel recognized that Elizabeth's family would retain ownership of Willow Creek and everyone enslaved there. The Carrington family attorney had made it clear that Elizabeth intended to sell many of the enslaved people, including Jacob, to traders who supplied the expanding cotton plantations of the Deep South. Samuel knew what this meant. He had heard the stories of families torn apart, of the brutal conditions on the sugar and cotton plantations of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The thought of his own flesh and blood disappearing into that system, potentially never to be seen again, became a torment Samuel could no longer bear. In the sleepless nights that followed, as he paced the floors of his study drinking whiskey until dawn, Samuel began to formulate a plan. He would use what remained of his personal fortune, money he had set aside separately from the plantation accounts, to purchase Jacob's freedom before the divorce was finalized. Yet this plan held its own cruel complications, for to do so would require him to admit publicly what he had never even whispered in private. The morning before the final divorce hearing, Samuel met with his attorney in Richmond. In the privacy of the oak-paneled office, with sweat beading on his brow despite the cool autumn air, Samuel confessed the truth about Jacob. His attorney, a pragmatic man who had witnessed many such confessions over decades of practice, advised Samuel that purchasing the freedom of his illegitimate son might prove legally challenging, but not impossible. However, he warned that such an action would destroy what remained of Samuel's reputation and standing in Virginia society. There would be no coming back from such a revelation. Samuel left the office that afternoon with the weight of his decision pressing upon him like the hand of judgment itself. The courtroom was sparse on the day of the final hearing, with only the judge, the attorneys, Samuel, Elizabeth, and 2 clerks present to witness the dissolution of the Thornton marriage. Elizabeth sat rigid in her seat, her face a mask of composure that revealed nothing of the humiliation and anger that had driven her to this point. When asked by the judge if he had any final statements to make before the decree was signed, Samuel remained silent, his eyes fixed on the papers before him. With a hand that shook almost imperceptibly, he signed his name to the document that ended 20 years of marriage. The judge then turned to the matter of property division, a formality as most details had been settled in prior negotiations. It was at this moment, as the clerk read aloud the list of assets to be retained by Elizabeth Carrington Thornton, including the names of enslaved individuals, that Samuel finally spoke. "I need to address one matter concerning the enslaved man called Jacob," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I wish to purchase his freedom with my personal funds before the settlement is finalized." The courtroom fell silent as Elizabeth turned to look at her former husband, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. The judge, slightly irritated by this last-minute complication, asked Samuel to explain his specific interest in this one enslaved person. Samuel rose to his feet, and in a voice that gained strength with each word, he revealed the truth that had haunted him for 2 decades. "Jacob is my son," he stated, "born to Hannah, who was enslaved at Willow Creek before my marriage to Elizabeth. I fathered him and have denied him acknowledgement all these years. I cannot leave this courtroom today knowing he remains enslaved, particularly as he faces sale to the Deep South plantations." The shock that rippled through the small courtroom was palpable. Elizabeth's face drained of color as the implications of Samuel's confession became clear. Not only had her husband been unfaithful with her cousin in recent years, but he had harbored this secret throughout their entire marriage. The son she had longed for but never conceived had existed all along, working in her fields, serving in her house, carrying her husband's blood in his veins. The judge, though clearly uncomfortable with this turn of events, was not unfamiliar with such situations. After a brief consultation with both attorneys, he ruled that Samuel would be permitted to purchase Jacob's freedom for a sum substantially above market value, with the money to be paid directly to Elizabeth as compensation. News of Samuel's revelation spread through Richmond society like wildfire, the scandal providing weeks of whispered conversation at dinner parties and social gatherings. For Samuel, the consequences were swift and severe. Invitations ceased, former friends crossed the street to avoid greeting him, and the doors of Richmond's better establishments quietly closed to him. Yet for the first time in 20 years, Samuel slept without the weight of his secret crushing his chest. 2 days after the divorce was finalized, he sent for Jacob to meet him at his attorney's office in Richmond. The young man arrived wary and confused, having been given no explanation for the summons. Jacob entered the attorney's office with caution, his eyes moving between Samuel and the lawyer, trying to discern the purpose of this unusual meeting. Samuel, struggling to find words adequate to the moment, simply handed Jacob the document of manumission, the legal paper that granted him freedom. As Jacob read the document, his expression moved from confusion to disbelief. When he looked up, Samuel finally spoke the words he had rehearsed countless times in his mind. "I am your father, Jacob. Your mother was Hannah, and you were born in the spring of 1822. I have wronged you both beyond measure by my silence and cowardice. You owe me nothing, not forgiveness nor understanding, but your freedom is yours now regardless." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Jacob stood motionless, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. Then, without a word, he placed the document carefully on the desk between them, turned and walked out of the office. Samuel made no move to follow him. He understood that freedom on paper did not erase 20 years of denied humanity, that his confession came far too late to form the foundation of any relationship. The damage inflicted could never be fully repaired. He would leave for North Carolina the following week as he had planned, though now he traveled alone with the knowledge of what he had done and what he had failed to do. I want to pause this story for a moment to ask you directly. When was the last time you trusted someone and felt that stab in your chest, that silent warning that something wasn't right? I know you may never have shared this with anyone. It's that pain we keep, thinking no one will understand. But here in this space we're creating together, your experience matters. If you felt this silent betrayal, leave in the comments just the words "I recognize this feeling," and see how many people share this invisible wound. Your comment could be the first step for someone to realize they're not alone on this journey. Let's continue the story now, but carrying this reflection with us. Jacob spent his first night of freedom walking the streets of Richmond, the manumission papers tucked safely inside his jacket. Freedom had come to him so suddenly, wrapped in a revelation so profound, that he could barely comprehend the change in his circumstances. By morning, he had made his way to a small community of free black people on the outskirts of the city, where a distant cousin of his mother's took him in temporarily. In the days that followed, Jacob learned of Samuel's departure from Virginia, apparently headed for North Carolina to start a new life. The news stirred complex emotions within Jacob: anger at the years of silent acknowledgement, confusion about his own identity, and a deep aching sorrow for his mother who had died never seeing her son free. Hannah had protected him as best she could within the confines of their enslaved reality, but she had never spoken of his father. Had she known it was Samuel? Had she carried that knowledge to her grave to protect her son from a truth too painful to bear? 3 months after gaining his freedom, Jacob made an unexpected appearance at the Richmond attorney's office, asking for Samuel's location in North Carolina. The attorney, bound by client confidentiality, initially refused, but something in Jacob's determined expression compelled him to reconsider. With reluctance, he provided the name of the small town where Samuel had settled. Winter was approaching when Jacob undertook the journey south, traveling carefully with his freedom papers always at hand, knowing that as a black man moving alone through the South, he was constantly vulnerable to those who might ignore his legal status for profit or malice. Samuel had purchased a modest farm outside Wilmington, where he lived alone, avoiding the society he had once been so eager to join. The widow he had corresponded with for years had broken ties after the scandal, unwilling to attach herself to a man so publicly disgraced. When Jacob appeared at his door on a cold December evening, Samuel stood speechless, believing for a moment that his guilty conscience had conjured a ghost. "Come in from the cold," he finally managed, stepping aside to allow Jacob entry into the small farmhouse. They sat across from each other at Samuel's kitchen table, steam rising from cups of coffee between them, silence stretching until it seemed it might never break. "I came to ask about my mother," Jacob said at last, his voice steady and controlled. "I need to know what happened between you." Samuel's face aged 10 years in an instant, the lines around his mouth deepening with shame. He spoke then of that spring day 20 years earlier, of his abuse of power, of the way he had forced himself on a young woman who could not refuse, whose humanity he had failed to recognize in that moment of selfish desire. He spoke of watching Jacob from a distance as he grew, of the growing certainty of his parentage and of his cowardice in remaining silent. Jacob listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing of the storm within him. When Samuel finally fell silent, having emptied himself of 20 years of secrets, Jacob asked one final question: "Did you ever love her at all?" The question hung in the air between them, and Samuel's eyes filled with tears he could no longer hold back. "Not then," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But later, watching her care for you, seeing her strength and dignity despite everything that had been taken from her, I began to understand what I had done, and that understanding grew into something like love, though she never knew it and would likely have rejected it if she had. It was too little, too late." Jacob nodded once, then rose from the table. He had his answer, incomplete and unsatisfying as it was. As he moved toward the door, Samuel asked if he might see Jacob again. Jacob paused, his hand on the latch. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I have your address now. If I choose to return, you'll know it's because I've found it in myself to try." 2 years passed. Samuel continued his solitary existence on the North Carolina farm, his days filled with physical labor that left little energy for dwelling on the past. He had written twice to Jacob, care of the attorney in Richmond, but had received no reply. Then, on a warm spring morning in 1845, a wagon appeared on the road leading to Samuel's farmhouse. Jacob sat at the reins, and beside him was a young woman. Samuel walked out to meet them, his heart pounding with uncertainty. "This is my wife Mary," Jacob said simply. "We're moving west, to Ohio. We thought you should know." The young couple stayed only long enough for a meal, the conversation careful and sparse. As they prepared to leave, Mary pressed a small package into Samuel's hands. "Open it after we've gone," she said kindly. Samuel stood in the dusty road long after the wagon had disappeared from view. Finally, he unwrapped the small package to find a hand-carved wooden frame containing a sketch of a woman's face. Though the artist's skill was modest, the likeness was unmistakable. Hannah's eyes looked back at him, rendered with the loving detail of a son's memory. Samuel held the portrait to his chest and wept freely for the first time in decades. Tears for Hannah, for Jacob, for the years lost to fear and shame, and for the tentative possibility of redemption that had arrived in a handmade frame, and the brief visit of a son who had found the courage to return, however briefly. In the complex tapestry of American slavery, there exist countless untold stories of parentage denied, of blood ties severed by the brutal institution that defined human beings as property. Samuel and Jacob's story is but one thread in this painful historical fabric, a reminder that the personal betrayals committed within the larger betrayal of human dignity have repercussions that echo through generations. The choices we make in moments of moral failing, to remain silent or to speak truth regardless of the cost, define not only our own character, but shape the lives of those connected to us by bonds both chosen and unchosen. Perhaps true freedom begins not with a legal document, but with the courage to face our deepest failures and the humility to seek forgiveness without expectation. If these stories of courage and betrayal during the slavery era touch your heart as they touch mine, I invite you to join our community. By subscribing to the channel, you'll have access to carefully researched stories that reveal long-hidden truths about our past, helping to understand wounds that still echo in our society. It's not just about knowing history, but about honoring the memory of those who lived these realities. Click subscribe and let's journey together in discovery and reflection.